Hello and welcome. We are here at Students for Life's Pro-Life Summit. It's the day after the March for Life. And by the way, anybody who wants exclusive early access to interviews just like this, join us at the Liz Wheeler Show community on Locals. That's lizwheelershow.com/locals. With me now is the policy director at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Rachel Bovard. Rachel, good to see you.
Always good to see you, Liz.
You just got off your panel a couple minutes ago. You were talking about the hybrid between big tech and the pro-life movement. Talk to me a little bit about this. What did you talk about?
So a couple of things. First of all, we've seen many groups censored on Facebook by big tech, none more so than the pro-life movement. And this is especially true for Students for Life, for Live Action, for Susan B. Anthony List. Anyone who makes ads that tell the truth about abortion somehow finds themselves on the cutting room floor because they've violated some unspoken rule. So we talked a little bit about that. And then also what's at stake, for the pro-life movement if, God willing, we find ourselves in a post-Roe world later this year.
Right, and that's so I talked to a lot of people at the march on the ground, both influencers, public officials, elected officials, and marchers, and that was one of the questions that I was asking, which I think is an interesting thought experiment. Hopefully it's not hypothetical, hopefully this becomes a reality, but what does a post-Roe world look like? And I believe it means that this fight for life, this fight against abortion is going to be sent back to the states. Are we prepared for that?
So this is the question, and I work on a lot of federal legislation. I worked on Capitol Hill for 10 years, so that's kind of my focus on where this issue has been. But as you point out, it's going to the states. And what I think people don't realize about this fight is that it's going to get bigger.
Yeah.
Because it is going to the states and because of this critical fact, which is that for the first time in 50 years, abortion can be legislated. We've never thought about it like that before, most of us anyway, right? Because it's been so long. We've thought about, the courts will handle it, or the White House will handle it. Well, no, not anymore. The self-government is going to have to handle it. And so that's where I think the conservative movement is, at the federal level, in any case, is not quite prepared for this. Because they've been able to hide, for so many years to say, President Trump will deal with it, right? And President Trump did deal with it, or the courts will deal with it. No, they've been able to hide behind having one pro-life vote a year and it not really mattering. But now this is where the rubber meets the road for legislators, not just in Congress, but all across the country. And so this is where the fight's going, and we're gonna have to gear up because it's not gonna be easy.
No, it's not. I talked a little bit about this when we were doing a live taping of my show with all these hundreds of students here. I talked a little bit about how it's not just gonna be in blue states either. The blue states are gonna become, unfortunately, sanctuary states for abortion. They're going to have very radical leftist abortion laws, and the focus is gonna become actually in the red states. The states with the most restrictive abortion laws is where Planned Parenthood is suddenly gonna target because they're gonna want abortion to be legal in those states. So if we have a post-Roe America, or if we have a hybrid, there are a lot of people that are saying, well, the Supreme Court's gonna try to uphold Roe while also upholding Mississippi's 15-week abortion ban, and that's possible. I acknowledge that hybrid could happen. What legislatively across the country, or what should that legislation look like that would restrict abortion as much as it can possibly be so?
Well, I think Mississippi's given us a great example, right? Their law, from the point of fetal viability, from the point of the heartbeat, in direct contradiction to what Roe and Casey said, they're passing these laws. And I think that's what you're gonna start to see percolate in some of these red states. And what's interesting is that, I've worked in Washington for 15 years now, and this has always been the fight that a lot of milquetoast Republicans never wanted to have.
Yeah.
When Texas passed their law, when Mississippi passed their law, Republicans in Washington were terrified because they say, the issue is so controversial, we don't want to deal with it. Well, they forget that across the country, the issue isn't controversial. Abortion is controversial. And what we just learned, I think, with Dobbs, with everything that happened with the Texas and Mississippi laws is, give me this fight. Because if you look at what the left put forward, if you watched the oral arguments in Dobbs, the pro-abortion movement, which includes 3 Supreme Court justices, embarrassed themselves completely. They put forward ridiculous arguments. In fact, Joe Biden's most effective lawyer walked right up to the line of defending Plessy versus Ferguson, that terrible Supreme Court case, which institutionalized Jim Crow segregation, because she couldn't admit that Roe could be overturned. You had people in the New York Times writing columns, men saying, I love Roe because it protects me from any consequence of having a casual fling. These are their arguments, okay? These are their arguments for abortion, and this is the argument we didn't want to have?
I was shocked, is to put it lightly, when I listened to those oral arguments, because I expected a nuanced argument from the pro-abortion lawyers, from the Biden administration arguing in favor of Roe. I expected legalese that I'd have to parse and analyze. Not at all.
Yeah.
They had the weakest arguments in favor of abortion that I've ever heard, that it's a woman's body. Not even acknowledging science that we know that it's not just a woman's body, or their argument that precedent can't be overturned.
Right.
I mean, it's entirely contradictory to the reality of the history of our country.
Or that the point of viability was a religious decision.
Yes.
When it's clearly a medical one. I mean, it was the stupidest set of arguments I've ever heard. And I was like, this is what we've been trying to avoid? Like, let's actually have this debate because these arguments are so bad.
Well, it's also, there's this dichotomy between elected officials or lobbyists in Washington, D.C. versus the voters in states. And I'm talking about voters, not just Republican voters or conservative voters or pro-life voters. I'm talking about Democrats. I'm talking about liberals. I'm talking about even those who identify as pro-choice or pro-abortion. The vast majority of people want abortion to be much more restricted than it is. I think the new Marist poll said that 71% of people, this includes both parties, want abortion restricted just to the first trimester. So sending this back to the states is a great idea, because even in states that we won't get it 100% abolished, we should get it restricted a lot more than it is.
Well, and this is why the pro-abortion movement does not want this to happen. They do not want abortion to be in the realm of self-government where it belongs, where voters can respond to new information, to medical science, to the intersection of morality and public policy. Those are the voters' decisions. What they want is what it's been for 50 years, which is judicial fiat imposed on the people without them having a say. One is, again, sort of an authoritarian response. The other is a democratic response. And that approach is something we also need to defend. As we're making the argument for life, we should be saying these decisions rest with the people. Because, the history of the pro-life movement is the more information people have about what abortion is, about what a baby looks like at 6 weeks, what a heartbeat sounds like, those cannot be denied. And, the more people see and hear and witness that, the more pro-life they become, in the sense that the more restrictions on abortion they support.
Well, this goes back to the big tech issue too. This is one of the reasons why big tech censors pro-life organizations, because they know information equals pro-life voters. Information equals fewer and fewer people supporting abortion, and that information is very powerful. Big tech is obviously in the pocket of the radical left. So let's talk about this for a second, because there is a divide, if you will, or even just a lack of surety in the conservative movement, in the Republican Party at large even, about how to handle the big tech problem. We have big tech that's obviously violating Section 230. They're obviously acting as a publisher with editorial privileges and not just as a platform, while they're enjoying the immunity from liability that only platforms are supposed to enjoy. They are actively censoring conservatives. Their terms of service are just outrageous. You can't even criticize people in positions of authority, let alone information that they define as scientific, even when it's questioned. I mean, it's draconian. I've been up against this for years, as have you. I mean, I've been demonetized on YouTube, on Facebook, just for citing scientific studies.
Right.
So let me ask you.
The wrong studies, obviously, the wrong ones.
Obviously, the ones that Facebook's fact checkers, who they pay but are still independent, deemed the wrong studies. What is, though, this is sort of the big picture question. What is the role of government if we're looking at it from a constitutional standpoint, a limited government standpoint? What's the role of the federal government in addressing the big tech problem?
So there's a couple ways to look at this. You mentioned Section 230, which is this tiny provision of law that's been, stretched by the courts to give bulletproof immunity to these companies. Originally it was designed to do one thing, and that was to clean up the internet, right? To take down porn, okay? The original title of Section 230, it was an amendment to a larger bill, was called the Family Online Empowerment Act. It had one purpose. Again, it has been totally stretched by the courts and abused by these companies. And it governs more than these companies. It governs sort of the internet at large. But for these particular companies, a lot of people like to talk about, well, they have First Amendment rights. Well, they do, but what they don't deserve is this protection that exists in law that was created by the government. So what the government has the right to do is to step in and reform that criteria, to say, oh, if you want this protection, then you have to behave a certain way. Nobody's forcing these companies to take the deal. If they don't want to, they can walk away. But if they're going to receive this benefit, which I think is tantamount to a massive financial subsidy, then they should be subject to a host of requirements that, again, Congress can address. Congress can say what these are. So I think that reforming Section 230 to be more reflective of the current internet environment, not the one that existed in 1996 when the law was passed, is totally appropriate for self-government, right? It created the law in the first place. The second area I would suggest where the government has a role is with the competition policies around these companies, because it is not illegal to be a big company in this country. It is not illegal to even be a monopoly. What is illegal is to be a predatory monopoly, to act in ways that actively harm your competitors, that are illegal, or ways that harm the free market in ways the law says are illegal. And that's something that conservatives have always been a little bit fuzzy about.
Yeah, because it's government versus big business. And, there's a conservative line of thought that says, well, big business might not be great when they're corrupt, but would you rather give that power over to a government bureaucrat? I don't know.
Well, this is the question, because conservatives support law enforcement everywhere, right, except in the marketplace. And my contention is that if we want the free market to exist and to work in ways that we know it can, you have to make sure it exists in the first place. And so that's why you saw the Trump DOJ bring an antitrust lawsuit against Google. You've seen the state attorneys general led by the state of Texas bring another lawsuit, 2 of them against Facebook and another against Google. So where there is evidence of harm that actually violates the law and a judge decides that, then yes, we should be supportive of that. And then the
last thing— Should they be broken up?
I think you could make a case that should be implemented. And the reason I'll say is this. In America, and there's a long congressional history of this, when we have a new innovation, right, that becomes so significant that it begins to change the way we live together. It begins to alter the flow of discourse in a free society, how we gather information, how we transact in the marketplace. When that occurs, it's the job of self-government to incorporate that innovation into our values and traditions, instead of simply just saying, well, these are private companies and they can reshape our society however they want. That has never been true. Congress, way back in the 1930s said with the radio industry, when it started to have the same effect almost as big tech, no, there needs to be some rules of the road here. They said the same thing with the banks, the railroads, all these different companies. Now, I would much prefer Congress do that job than some nameless, faceless bureaucrat who probably hates me, right, at FTC or DOJ.
It's a badge of honor.
Right, yeah. So I would love Congress to actually step up and do that. And you're starting to see Congress engage in this fight. But this is something for the voters acting through their representatives to decide, because at the end of the day, we're in the driver's seat here. Google's not in the driver's seat.
Well, I think one of the things in the broader conservative movement is a lot of conservatives don't know what their options are.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know what the right policy to advocate for to address this problem, because they don't want it to become, we'll take the healthcare industry, for example. They don't want to look at the insurance companies and say, listen, the insurance companies are corrupt. No one wants to have to get permission from insurance in order to get the healthcare that they and their doctor need. But at the same time, it would be jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire to give that power from the insurance companies to a government bureaucrat like Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that a lot of conservatives feel the same way about big tech, is they don't know exactly what their options are. They don't want government to be in charge of an industry. They worry maybe even that it's a comparative to the utilities, right? That they were federalized in a sense, government took over, and they don't know what that looks like. And so understanding a little bit more what the options are and what to advocate for, I think would be of service to our nation as a whole, especially as conservatives face censorship day in and day out.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the utilities, because Justice Clarence Thomas, the greatest sitting Supreme Court justice, in my opinion, recently wrote a concurrence a couple of months ago talking about this idea.
He compared it to utilities, yeah.
He basically said, have these companies become so important to our discourse, to access to the market, that they do deserve what he calls common carriage, right? This common carrier approach, the same thing that we do for the telephone companies, right? We say, okay, the government will give you a series of privileges, and in exchange, you will allow all comers to access your platform. And he's saying, does Google, rise to that level? Does Facebook? This is a question he's saying Congress should be asking itself. Not the Department of Justice, not the Federal Trade Commission, but Congress. And I think that's a very good question that Congress needs to be grappling with. Because, again, it goes back to this idea, too. Conservatives have always said, well, if you're unhappy with something, build your own.
Yeah.
And we are doing it, right? You're on locals right now. We have all these different conservative alternatives. But for me, I worry that when something becomes so successful, we live in such a concentrated market now that it won't be allowed to succeed. And the example of this is what happened to Parler.
Yes, they weren't even allowed to compete because
as soon as they became effective, as soon as they became a threat to Twitter, you saw within 48 hours, Apple, Google, and Amazon all
Just shut them down.
allegedly not working together suddenly,
Oh,
right?
yeah,
Like
it's
shut
just
them
a
down
crazy
completely.
coincidence.
Right, and those were 3 really concentrated industries saying to a small competitor, a small business, you will not be allowed to exist because we set the terms.
Well, that's going back to what you said before. That's the difference between being a monopoly and being predatory.
Correct.
Because
Yeah.
they were not just saying like, well, we're bigger than you, so we're probably going to succeed, and you might die off because we can offer a better product. They were saying, no, we're actively going after you. We are going to stomp you out. And the reason for that, of course, wasn't any financial interest of their own. It was purely ideological.
Correct, yeah. And you see this with all hundreds of small businesses that I hear from on a weekly basis, because people think about Google and Facebook as speech platforms, and they are speech platforms, but they are also market access platforms. Millions of small businesses rely on accessing the mainstream market through Google and through Facebook. And when you have this ideological censorship that is going on at these companies, you see conservative small businesses being shut down, left and right for, sometimes they're not even told why. You saw conservative book publisher, conservative children's book publisher, right? Children's books about Ronald Reagan and Amy Coney Barrett deplatformed from Facebook. They lost all the data they had on their users. They lost access to the advertising market. And Facebook is one of the biggest digital ad agencies in the world, right? For no reason. They had no reason was given to them. Facebook walked it back and said, oh, it was a mistake.
Well, they always say that. Well, it's a
mistake.
mistake, right? It's a mistake when the backlash gets large enough that they're worried about
When
what's going to
Brit
happen.
Hume is tweeting about it, suddenly it's a mistake.
It's Heroes of
Yeah.
Liberty, by the way, for
Heroes of
everyone
Liberty,
watching,
right, yeah.
so that you can go and support them. So what do you hope to see then? Think about the next year. Think about maybe even not just this year, but next year when we hopefully are going to control Congress. What do you hope to see in regards to Section 230, in regards to antitrust legislation, in regards to big tech as a whole? What do you want to happen?
So I think the plan for big tech has to be comprehensive. There's no one silver bullet that's going to solve this problem, and I would caution anyone who comes to you and said, this one thing will do it. Probably not, right? We always love a simple solution, but there probably isn't one. So I think it's going to take Section 230 reform. I think it's going to take robust antitrust enforcement on those cases that have already been filed. And I think it's going to take Congress changing some laws around big tech, not, specifically for Google or specifically for Facebook, but around this new innovation to say, this is what you can do and this is what you can't do. So for Google, for instance, if a company reaches the digital ad size of Google, where someone compared it in a legal brief recently to, owning all sides of the New York Stock Exchange. When a company, becomes that dominant, well, you can be the buy side or the sell side, but you can't be both. Right? We regulate our financial markets this way. Maybe we should take a look at, the digital ad space
Should they
as well.
be treated as common carriers, as common carriage?
Yeah, there's a lot of members of Congress that support that approach, and I think that's another approach that has a lot of value, has a lot of merit. My personal belief is that, I want the market to work. So I think if we create a free market in tech where there isn't one with antitrust enforcement, then you can compete a lot of these concerns away rather than entrenching the service as a monopoly through common carrier.
Right. I think that this is exactly what the conservative movement needs. This conversation needs to be had, and then these policies need to be argued, debated, and legislated so that we actually are in a marketplace of ideas instead of conservatives being ideologically censored by big tech. Rachel Bovard, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. As always, remember, if you want exclusive early access to interviews just like this, you can join us on the Liz Wheeler Show community on Locals. That's lizwheelershow.com/locals. If you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button below, and ring the bell to make sure you never miss a video.